It was a question nobody in that room expected him to answer honestly. Mr. Eastwood, what's your biggest regret? The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next thing. The specific held breath quiet of 200 people who suddenly understood that something real was about to happen in a room that had been carefully designed to prevent exactly that. Clint looked at the reporter, then he looked at the room, then he answered. And nobody who was there that evening has ever forgotten what he said. It was November 2004. The venue was a private industry event in Beverly Hills, one of those evenings that exists at the intersection of celebration and business, where the speeches are carefully written and the answers to difficult questions are even more carefully managed. Clint was there to receive a lifetime achievement recognition from a directors organization he had been a member of for over 30 years. The room was full of people who knew him professionally, directors, producers, writers, actors, the particular gathering of Hollywood's working class that assembles for these events and brings with it decades of shared history and carefully maintained professional relationships. The format was a conversation on stage. A respected moderator, a journalist named Helen Marsh, who had been covering Hollywood for 20 years, would ask questions, and Clint would answer. The questions had been submitted in advance and approved. The evening was meant to be warm, celebratory, a tribute to a career that had few equals in the history of American cinema. Helen Marsh had other ideas. She had been given a list of approved questions. She had also spent 3 weeks preparing questions that were not on the list. She was a journalist. That was what journalists did. And she had spent 20 years in this industry watching carefully managed public figures deliver carefully managed answers to carefully managed questions. And she had grown over those 20 years, deeply tired of it. She had seen too many of these evenings produce nothing but the performance of honesty, the careful simulacrum of a real person saying real things assembled from rehearsed answers and strategic vulnerability, and the particular kind of false intimacy that passes for candor in public life. The first 40 minutes went exactly as planned. Questions about specific films, about working methods, about the transition from acting to directing, about favorite collaborators, about the Western as a genre, and what it had meant to American cultural identity over the course of the 20th century. Clint answered everything with a directness that people who knew him expected no performance, no deflection, no searching for the safest version of each answer. Just clear, considered responses delivered in that unhurried voice that had the quality of someone who had thought carefully about things over many decades and wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. The audience laughed at the right moments. Everything was proceeding exactly as these evenings were designed to proceed. Then Helen Marsh looked down at her notes, looked up at Clint, and asked the question that wasn't on the approved list. Mr. Eastwood, what's your biggest regret? The silence was immediate. Not the silence of hostility, the silence of attention, 200 people leaning forward slightly without being aware they were doing it. Clint looked at her. His expression didn't change the way expressions change when someone is caught genuinely off guard, the small involuntary widening, the brief search for footing. It changed in a different way. Something shifted behind his eyes, a very slight recalibration, as if he were deciding not which answer to give, but how much of the true answer to give. How much of the thing he actually thought was appropriate to say in a room full of 200 people, most of whom he knew professionally but not personally, in a building in Beverly Hills at an event with a program and a timeline and a car waiting outside. He was quiet for 4 or 5 seconds. In a room of 200 people, that is a very long time. Then he said, I spent too many years being efficient. The room didn't react. not because the answer wasn't interesting, because they weren't sure it was finished. It wasn't, I made films on tight schedules, Clint said. I'm known for that. Came in on time, came in under budget, moved fast, kept the crew happy because nobody was waiting around. I'm proud of the efficiency. It served me well, and it served the people I worked with. But efficiency has a cost that I didn't fully understand until later in my career. When you're moving fast, you miss things, not technical things. I didn't miss technical things. You miss moments. You finish a scene that worked and you move on because the schedule says to move on, because there are 35 other things that need to happen today, and you move on. And sometimes what you left behind was something that could have been extraordinary if you'd stayed with it 20 minutes longer. He paused. There was a scene in one of my films, I won't say which one, where an actor did something in take 3 that I've never seen anyone do before or since on a film set. Something completely unplanned, completely true, the kind of moment that happens once in a production, if you're lucky, and most productions never get at all. And I said, cut, and moved on because we were behind schedule and I needed to get to the next setup. The take we used was good. The film worked. But the take I left behind was something else entirely. Something I have never been able to fully describe because I've never seen anything exactly like it again. I've thought about that take for 30 years. The room was completely still. Nobody was comfortable. The regret isn't the scene, Clint said. The scene worked. The film worked. The audience never knew what they didn't see. The regret is the habit of mind that made moving on feel more urgent than staying. That's what efficiency does to you over time if you let it become the primary value. It teaches you that good enough is good enough, and most of the time it is. But sometimes the extraordinary thing is one takeaway, one conversation away, 1 hour away, and you will never know because you already called it a day. You already decided that what you had was sufficient. And sufficient is the enemy of extraordinary. Helen Marsh looked at him for a moment. She had not expected this answer. Nobody in the room had expected this answer. She had asked the question as a journalist asks difficult questions, probing, slightly provocative, designed to find the edge of the prepared surface and get beneath it. She had found something beneath the surface. She had found something real. She wasn't entirely sure in that moment what to do with it. She decided to stay quiet. She had learned over 20 years that silence, correctly deployed, was the most powerful tool a journalist possessed. Is there anything else? She asked quietly after a moment. Clint looked at her. Something moved across his face slowly, the way things move across the faces of people who have learned to control their expressions but cannot control everything. People in the room would later describe what they saw differently. Some called it sadness. Some called it honesty. Some called it the expression of a man who has carried something a long time and decided to put it down. Yes, he said. He looked at the room then, not at Helen Marsh, not at the moderator's table, at the room itself, at the 200 people who had come to celebrate his career and were now sitting in the specific charged silence of people who understand that they are witnessing something that the evening was not designed to contain. I work too much, Clint said. I know that will sound like a strange regret from someone in this particular room, but there are people who deserved more of my time than I gave them. People who were present in my life during the years when I was most focused, most driven, most convinced that the project in front of me was the most important thing happening in the world. Those people got the version of me that was left over after the work was done. The remainder, that's not enough. It was never enough. I knew it at the time, and I did it anyway because I believed in what I was making. I still believe in what I made, but belief in the work is not an excuse for what the work costs the people around you. That's a distinction I was slow to make, much slower than I should have been. He stopped. The room stayed silent. I made about 40 films, he said, after a moment. Each one of them required me to be completely present for months at a time, completely absorbed. There is no other way to make a serious film. It costs your full attention, and then your full attention before production and during production, and in the editing room afterward, and then some portion of your attention that doesn't come back for weeks after you've finished, because the thing you've been living inside for months doesn't just release you the moment you walk off the set for the last time. It follows you. And while it's following you, the people who have been waiting are still waiting. I'm not sure any filmmaker has solved that problem. I certainly didn't. He paused, but I think I could have been more honest about it. Instead of disappearing into the work and hoping the people I loved would understand, I could have said, here is what I am giving to this. Here is what that is going to mean for the time we have. I'm asking you to accept that, and I understand completely if you find that you can't. That conversation is much harder than the one I had, which was essentially no conversation at all. But it is the honest conversation. I didn't have it enough. And some of the people who deserved it from me are gone now. You can't have that conversation with someone who is gone. That's the kind of regret that doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't resolve with time. It doesn't soften the way other things soften. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are. Helen Marsh waited a moment. Then, do you think the work was worth it? Clint looked at her for a long moment. He almost smiled. Not the performance of a smile, the real slow, complicated thing that moves across a face when the question being asked is one the person has spent years alone with, the kind of expression that has grief in it and something like acceptance in equal measure, the two things sitting together without resolving into either one. I think the work was real. He said, I believe the films I made mattered to people. I've had strangers tell me more times than I can count that a film of mine got them through something, that a character I played gave them something to hold on to during a period when they had very little to hold on to, that a story I told helped them understand something about their own life that they couldn't previously articulate. That means something to me. That will always mean something to me for whatever time I have left. He paused. But mattering to people you will never meet is not the same thing as being present for the people who were there. Both things can be true simultaneously. The work can be real, and the cost can be real, and the regret can be real, and none of them cancel each other out. That is the thing I didn't understand when I was young. I thought that if the work was good enough, it justified everything around it. It doesn't. It justifies itself, nothing more. The work is its own justification and its own reward, and it has to be enough on its own terms because it does not transfer to other parts of your life. The films I made do not make me a better father or a better partner or a better friend. They make me someone who made those films. That is all they do. He looked at his hands again, large, weathered hands, resting still on his knees. I'm better at it now, he said quietly, almost to himself. I got better at it, later than I should have, much later, but I got there. The room held its silence for another moment, and then someone began to applaud, not the enthusiastic, coordinated applause of a crowd responding to a cue, the careful, genuine applause of people who have heard something true and want to honor it without overwhelming it. It spread slowly through the room, the way real things spread, not because anyone decided it was time, but because 200 people had been given something unexpected, and the only response available was this one. Clint nodded once. That was all he did. Afterward, in the lobby and the cars home and the phone calls the next morning, people kept returning not to the moment of the question, but to the moment after the last answer, the moment when he looked at his hands and said quietly, I got there. Because that is the part the question hadn't reached and the applause hadn't captured. Not the regret. Anyone who had ever chosen the work over the people they loved recognized it immediately. But the end of the regret. The I got there. The understanding offered without ornamentation, without the performing of wisdom, just stated quietly in that room while 200 people sat still. That character is not fixed, that it is not something you are born with or fail to be born with, something settled in childhood and carried unchanged through a life, that it is built slowly over decades through choices, some right, some deeply wrong, some complicated enough that they will never be fully one or the other, that the building never stops. Clint Eastwood did not perform humility that evening. He did not stage a moment of strategic vulnerability designed to make an audience feel close to a public figure. He sat in a chair and answered a question without flinching, without softening it, without the careful hedges that people in public life use to protect themselves from the full weight of what they are saying. In the specific, undecorated language of someone who has stopped needing the statement to reflect well on him and only needs it to be true. That is what integrity looks like at the end of a long life. Not the end, because regret without possibility is just weight. It sits on you and confirms what you feared about yourself and goes nowhere useful. But regret with possibility is different. It is a map. It shows you where you have been, and if you are willing to look at it clearly rather than fold it up and put it in a drawer, it shows you where you still have time to go. Clint Eastwood had time. He used it later than he wanted, exactly when he was ready. That evening in Beverly Hills, in front of 200 people who had come to celebrate his films, he gave them something more valuable than anything he had put on screen. He gave them the truth about what the films had cost, what he had done about it, and that it was not too late, not for him, not for any of us. If this story moved, you subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who has ever chosen the work over the people who deserved more, someone who is still choosing, someone who needs to hear that the regret and the work can both be real, and that even after decades of getting it wrong, it is never too late to get there. Clint Eastwood got there. So can you